Bible Club, there's Bible Club, there's Bible Club in our town. There's singing, there's laughing, let's get the word on the ground. We're all excited, and we are all delighted. There's Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club in our town.
All right, thank you, Mrs. Kate. I asked her to do that illustration for us because last week we started learning about David, and she asked a question that some of you should have known the answer to, because we had 5 things. Remember? Samuel went to anoint a new king over Israel. Who is the king of Israel right now in our lessons? Who's the king? It's a man. Does anybody remember his name? Class? Saul. Saul is the king of Israel, but Saul disobeyed God a couple times, and God said through Samuel that he would no longer be king, and that he would find a man after his own heart to be king of Israel. Now, then God came to Samuel and said, I want you to go to, do you remember what town that he went to? It's a town that we hear about at Christmas time. Does anybody know the town that he went to? Not the North Pole. Wasn't the North Pole. Aaron? You're just saying that to be silly. I'm not going to call on you if you say things to be silly. I want real answers. North Pole was a good try, but the beach was not. One more chance, and then I'm going to say call on somebody I think knows. What do you think? Oh, little town of. Class? Bethlehem. That's right. So Samuel went to Bethlehem, and he was supposed to make sure he was going to give a big sacrifice. He was going to offer a sacrifice. They were going to eat a feast of the meat from that sacrifice. And he's supposed to make sure that a certain man's family was there. Now, I probably just said it once or twice, so let's see if there's anybody who had extra sharp ears to hear and extra sharp mind to remember. What was the name of the man who's supposed to bring all of his sons to the feast? Cody? Jesse. That's right. Jesse was supposed to bring all of his sons to the feast, and there they were, and Samuel saw the first one, and when he saw the first one, he thought, now that first son of Jesse, he looks like he could be a good king, right? And right then, what did God say to Samuel? No. He said, nope. He said, God said to Samuel, not him, for the Lord seeth not as man sees, for man looks on the outward appearance. All we can see is the shell of the egg, right? But the Lord looks on the heart. And the second son came, and the third son came, and the fourth, and the fifth, and sixth, and the seventh. None of them were, God said none of them were the king. And Samuel was like, well, now I thought there was supposed to be, Jesse, do you have another son? And he said, oh yeah, we have one more. Do you remember where the 8th son was? Where was he? He was out in the fields. And what was he doing out in the fields? He was with the sheep. He wasn't playing. He was working. He was watching the sheep. And when that son, David, came before Samuel, Samuel heard from God that that was the one. That meant that God knew David's heart, didn't he? And what did he know was in David's heart? We talked about these things last week. What was in David's heart? What did we know that David did in his heart? He believed God, right? Remember we talked about people that don't believe there's a God? What does the Bible call somebody who doesn't believe there's a God? Do you remember that? Aaron? Shh. What does the Bible call somebody who doesn't believe God? The Bible says a fill in the blank says in his heart, there's no God. A what? It was close. Cody knows the answer. An atheist? An atheist is somebody who says there's no God. But what does the Bible call an atheist? An atheist is somebody who says there's no God. Says, I don't believe God created anything. I don't believe God is powerful. I don't believe God is anywhere. And the Bible says that somebody that believes that, do you remember it, Aaron? A fool. That's right. A fool. Then God knew that David had a thankful heart. And he knew that David had a dependent heart. He didn't think that he could do everything by himself. He depended on God to help him. He knew that David had a repentant heart. That means that David wasn't a perfect man. He didn't have a perfect heart. But when he sinned, he turned back to God and asked God to forgive him. And God forgives us when we ask for his forgiveness, doesn't he? And then he saw that David had a trusting heart. He trusted God. So, I said at the end of last week's lesson that Samuel anointed David with oil. That was a special ritual that they did to say this man is going to be the king. But David was only probably 16 or 17 years old. How many of you know somebody that's 16 or 17 years old? Yeah. Would you want them to be the king of your country? They're not ready to be king. And David wasn't ready to be king, but God had chosen him to be the king. And so, where did David go at the end of last week's story? Remember? I'll tell you. He went back to the fields with the sheep. Now, the Bible tells us that there's something that David really liked to do. He liked to sing. In fact, he would even write some of his own songs. And his songs weren't like the songs that we hear today, especially not the ones on the radio. Lots of his songs are in the Bible. There's a book called the Book of Psalms, and he wrote more than half of them. So he would write his songs, and he played an instrument. He played a harp. Now, not a big harp. He could carry his harp around, and he would play his harp and sing his songs. And he probably did that when the sheep were all doing just fine. He would sit there and play his harp. And but then, sometimes, the sheep weren't doing just fine. There were wild animals out that liked to eat sheep, right? Yep. Once, a lion came along, right? And another time a bear came along, and David depended, right? He depended on God to give him the strength to protect those sheep. Now, so even though David was anointed king, who was the king at this time? Who was still the king? Kaylee? Saul was. Now, when we look at Saul, he looks like a good man, doesn't he? He was tall. His shoulders were taller than everybody else's head. Everybody would think, whoa, we want him to be our king because he looks like a king. He's strong and he's big. But what could God see? We could see that he's tall and strong. But what could God see? God could see more than just the outside, couldn't he? God could see the inside. Now, we've been talking about Saul for several weeks now. Can any of you remember something or think? Because we've told what Saul was like on the inside. When God looked on Saul's heart, on the inside of Saul, what did he see? We know this because the Bible tells us. But we wouldn't have been able to tell ourselves. Because we can just see the outside. But God looked on the heart. What did God see in Saul's heart? What do you think? What are some things that Saul was in his heart? Ian? Wickedness. Wickedness? Yes, that's true. But let's see if we can think of what kinds of wickedness. Silas?
Sinful.
He was sinful. Yes, that's true. What kinds of sinful? We'll give one more try. Now, I hope you kids understand that. This is only his second week here, and he's very little. I don't want the rest of you running around like him. He's going to learn in a few weeks how he should act. And we'll put up with it for a couple weeks, right? Because we're older, and we can still pay attention even though he's learning how to act.
Okay, sinful.
Yeah, he was sinful. Okay, so let me tell you, let me remind you of some of these things. So, David, inside his heart, was a believing heart, a thankful heart, a dependent heart, a repentant heart, a trusting heart. But inside Saul's heart, Saul had a disobedient heart. Do you remember that God told Saul to take his armies and do something? And did he do it?
No.
Part way. He did it part way, right? But he didn't do it all the way. What is it if we just obey part way? Is it obedience or disobedience? Disobedience. And for you too, right? For me too. If you or me, if we obey part way, what does God say that is? Disobedience. It's not obedience. Then, the Bible says he was dishonest. What does dishonest mean?
You're not telling the truth.
You're not telling the truth about something, right? Samuel came to Saul and said, didn't God tell you to destroy these people? And he said, oh, we destroyed everything. And what did Samuel have to say? What does it mean that I hear these sheep making their noises and cows? Right? He disobeyed and then he lied about it. He says, oh, I obeyed. That's dishonest, isn't he? And then he makes excuses. So Samuel said, what about these sheep? And what did Saul do? He said, oh, the people. He blamed it on somebody else. Now let's be honest. Let's just no one look around. No one look around. Bow your head and close your eyes. I'm not even looking. How many of you have ever blamed somebody else for something that you did wrong? Okay, you can put your hands down, because I know all of us have done that. We make excuses. That you can put your heads up now. But we do that, don't we? And that's sin. That's like related to being dishonest. And he was rebellious. God said do something, and he said no. The Bible says that disobedience and that is like rebellion. But who was he? He was the king. Now when Samuel anointed David with oil and anointed him to be king, the Bible says that the Spirit of God came on him. And deep in Samuel's heart, he knew that God was going to use him someday to be king. And the Bible says in just one or two verses later, it says that God took his spirit away from Saul. And God let an evil spirit come into Saul's life. And Saul, from that day on, he was grumpy, he was suspicious, he was angry, he would have fits, he was afraid of things. And he was not somebody that you would want to be around. Nobody wanted to be around him. All of Saul's helpers, they would watch him. They were scared that he might get angry with them. He had an evil spirit. His mind was hurting. His spirit, even his body, he would just feel terrible in his body when that evil spirit would really be afflicting him. And one of his helpers said, Saul, we should see if we can find somebody that can play some music for you whenever this evil spirit comes along, and maybe that will make it so that you can be calmer and feel better. And Saul says, you know somebody that can do that? find me a man that can come and play music for me. And who do you think they found? Who do you think they found? Who do you think?
The time.
Who?
The time.
The son? Yes. Do you remember his name? Not anymore? They found David. They found David. And so Saul said, ask Jesse, who's that? David's father, if his son David can come and stay in my palace and play his music for me, and I'll even make him part of my bodyguards. Now, did David know anything about being a king? No. All he knew about was God, and he knew about being a shepherd, right? Watching sheep. But God made it so David could go into the king's palace. And he was there with the king. Now, did Saul know that God had chosen David to be the next king? No, he probably would have killed him because he wanted to be the king still. And he didn't much care about God anymore, did he? But God worked it out so that David could be in the palace watching how Saul governed the country, hearing people's questions that came to Saul, hearing how the problems that a country has that needs to be taken care of by the king. And David was able to be there and hear all that stuff. And when the evil spirit came on Saul and he was extra fearful and grumpy and felt terrible, David would come and he would play his music. He would sing some of those songs that he had written, and he would play on his harp. And you know, the Bible says that when David played his music, you think his music was music that God would like? You think David's music was music that God would like? Yeah, I think so. And when David would play his music, the Bible says that Saul's body would feel better, his mind would feel better, and his spirit would feel better too. Do you know that music can affect us in our mind? It can affect our spirit, and it can affect our body. And so if music tries to get our body to do things that are bad, should we listen to that kind of music? No. If music puts bad information in our mind or makes us have a bad attitude, should we listen to that kind of music?
Nope.
No. If music is against God's spirit and goes along with the devil or the world's spirit, should we listen to that kind of music? No. Music is very powerful, and this music that David would play helped Saul. And we should think about two things in today's lesson. One, what kind of music do we listen to? Is our music the music like David would have played, or is it different? Yeah. Is it more like, well, does it give us a bad attitude? Does it help us want? Does it make us want to do what we want instead of what our parents want? How about that? Think about it. We want to make sure we listen to good music. And the other thing we need to remember is that God sees the inside of us. And something we should know is that the Bible teaches us that what's inside of us, Jesus said 1,000 years after this, that what's inside of a person will come out. If you're going along and everybody thinks you're a nice person and all of a sudden you say evil, wicked, mean things, you know what that tells us? That's what's inside your heart. Even though people think you're a nice person, if you have a nasty mouth, that's what's inside your heart. Out of the heart, the mouth speaks. So sometimes we can tell what's inside a person, but not by looking, but by seeing what they say, by listening to what they say. So we should remember this, and we should ask ourselves, and we should ask God to help us. You think David wasn't a good man because he did all that by himself? What did he do? Oh, this is Saul. We don't want to be like Saul. He trusted God. When he did things wrong, He repented. He depended on God to help him. He was thankful, and he believed in God. And we should, in our hearts, on the inside, we should do all that. And if we are doing all that in our hearts on the inside, then outside of us, the person that people see will be a nice, godly person if our inside person is godly. If we just try to make our outside person be a nice person, but inside we're ugly, and we're selfish, and we're disobedient, the outside person's not going to stay a nice person for very long at all. So what will you do? What kind of person will you be? And as you get older and realize that you can't change your inside person because we're born sinners, I hope you will remember the things that we've taught you. How that Jesus died on the cross and then rose again so that he can take control of our inside person and help us to be and forgive all of those sins and make it so that we can have fellowship with God.